All right, good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us again for another episode of our class, our Christian formation series, Race, Whiteness, and the Church. This lesson is entitled Systemic Racism and the Powers. As you know, we have talked about four guiding goals through the course of this Christian formation series: to understand more history of race and the experience of being Black in America, to discuss the concept of institutional racism, which is what we're doing today, this morning, to understand more about how the sin of racism has impacted the health, unity, and witness of the church, and to explore how we at Grace Seattle can be a healing community in the midst of this history and dynamics of our society. So, what is systemic racism? Basically, it's the idea that baked into our laws and culture of our society and our institutions like businesses, education system, police, etc., are regulations and cultures and norms that limit access to wealth and other social goods and disadvantage some people on the basis of race. So that is the general idea. And this can be an implicit or unintentional bias. Like you see this gentleman here, the people who designed the curbs didn't think about, they were able, and they didn't think of people who were differently able to make cutouts for him to move down the street. They were in their own way of seeing things and not thinking about other people's way of seeing things. Or systemic racism can be explicit and intentional. This photograph is Tuskegee Airmen, but just here to represent the fact that after World War II, where there was a GI Bill, there were Congress people who specifically lobbied to make the administration of the bill at the state level, specifically so the South and other places could prevent Black GIs from receiving the benefits. And that was an explicit choice based on race. Is systemic racism a Marxist idea? I was trying to look through various critiques, and something that often comes up on message boards and discussions about this idea. And I think one reason that some Christians are wary of the term is that it out there in the sort of blogosphere, it's associated with Marxism. I don't think it's reasonable to associate it with Marxism. I think that as far as I can tell, the reasons for this association are largely because it does come out of the discipline of sociology. And sociology, actually, Marx was a sociologist. He was one of the founding scholars back in the 1800s of sociology. So to say that it's Marxist is really the same thing as saying that modern psychology is related to Freud, and maybe Freud has anti-Christian ideas as well, but we all are pretty comfortable with going to a counselor and seeing a psychologist. So it's sort of a buzzword that can be used to paint this and to create fearmonger around this term that I think is unfair and unnecessary and really unfounded. Are there Black people who do not believe in systemic racism? This is sort of a joke or tongue-in-cheek. There are Black people that probably believe just about anything, certainly just about anything that white people believe. But sometimes, in these kind of discussions, people will throw out someone like this gentleman here, Professor Glenn Lowry. He's a professor of economics at Brown University and a leading Black intellectual who is conservative and is not really thrilled with the idea of systemic racism. To say, well, hey, there are Black people who, don't support this idea. And that's true. It doesn't really necessarily mean anything one way or the other. But I've read some of his stuff and watched some stuff on YouTube, and one of the things he points out is he believes there are other reasons for the disparities that exist in culture. Two things that he mentions are a culture of lack of agency among Black people in the United States, and broken families and the impact of lack of fathers and mentors on the Black community. And those things, I think, are fair arguments. There's certainly things that one can discuss, but my question when it comes to this is, if those two things are true, for instance, why are they true? What is the history that has led to those two circumstances? And I would say that goes back to systemic racism. Is there a situation, arguably, of more broken families in Black communities? That has to do with the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow and everything since then. Does systemic racism try to turn an effect into a cause? This is another possible critique. Because a lot of what this whole framework relies on is saying, hey, there are disparities between Black people and white people, and the cause then must reside in the system. But some people say that, it's intellectually, not really a clear idea because it's really turning an effect into a cause. It's not really explaining why the outcomes are different for people. And yes, I think there's something to that argument. In general, it's not super specific about the cause, but it locates the cause within different prevailing laws and regulations and norms in different institutions. Isn't racism an individual problem? And this is something that I think the whole idea of institutional racism is really important for us to discuss, because it's easy for us, I think, for white people to say, well, really racism is just some white people that weren't raised right, and they're just not polite. They say some words that they ought not to say, and maybe even resort to violence on the extremes. But my contention is that racism is a much bigger problem than just some people who use words that they ought not to use and are impolite and possibly violent. Those individual people who act with bad behavior don't explain the broad disparities that we have in society between white people generally and Black people generally. And so there's this problem, I think, that exists in our culture right now where, Hitler is sort of the example that everyone comes to when you're talking about something bad, and racist or bigot have really just become the ultimate pejoratives in our culture. And so as a result, the terms have lost meaning. And this can cause complacency. Because as white people, we can think, well, as long as we're polite and we're nice and we don't say the wrong things or perpetrate violence, we're doing all we can do. And this also scapegoats sort of people who we might think is unenlightened. Sometimes we have redneck jokes and so on, rather than looking at people who might be violent and prejudiced as a symptom of a bigger cause of structural problems in our society. And it really covers over the fact that there is a real distinction between individual acts that are mean or not polite or violent or prejudiced, and large persistent economic and social forces that cause disparity. So if racism is more than an individual bad behavior, what is it? And here, I think some of us, many of us, maybe all of us have seen various statistics, but I'm going to run through these here because I think they really serve to underline this point. And the sources here are listed, and if you want to follow up with me, I'm happy to send these articles out to you. A few articles that do a really nice job with charts and statistics. But one thing that I find really compelling about the idea of systemic racism is that it's really based on hard data and statistics about different outcomes that we can look and we can see numbers and how people along lines of race have different outcomes in our society. And not only is this useful because, to the extent that we believe in science and data, it's a trustworthy source of information. But also, I think it allows us, us white people, a way of seeing, a different way of seeing. Often we all tend to be friends with people and connected to people who are similar to us in race, in politics, and many other things. And that helps whatever kind of situation we're talking about. It creates situations where it's hard for us to put ourselves in other people's shoes and understand circumstances that are different than our own, because everyone who we know is like us. But when you look at these numbers, it provides a way of seeing that, oh, actually, for some people, life is different. So maternal health, we'll start from the beginning and move through kind of human life cycle. 42 Black women out of 100,000 die of pregnancy-related causes versus 13 white women, which is more than 3 times the difference. Infant mortality rate is 11 in the United States for Black children versus 5 for white children out of 1,000. Food insecurity, according to the USDA, so again, a trusted source of information, 21% of Black households struggle with food insecurity versus 8% of white families. So that's more than twice, almost 3 times the difference. And in recent news with coronavirus, according to the Brookings Institute in April 2020, 23% of all US families were food insecure, which is much higher than normal times. But as many as 1/3 of Black families struggled with food insecurity. So it has gotten worse in recent times. And of course, the disparity continues between white and Black people in the time of coronavirus. In education, less than 1/3 of Black students attain a bachelor's degree or higher, while almost 50% of white students attain a bachelor's degree or higher. And in public education, even though we've desegregated schools, more than half of US schools are 75%, either 75% white or 75% non-white. And average funding per student for schools that are 75% non-white or more is on average $2,000 less than for white schools. In healthcare, differences exist as well. In 2013, 25% of Black people did not have insurance compared to 15% of white people. By 2016, the disparity had halved thanks to what we call Obamacare. But since then, it has again worsened that disparity. And in recent news with the coronavirus, Black Americans, and we've all heard these headlines in the news, but Black Americans are dying from COVID at a rate of 1.9 times the rate of white Americans. 18% of COVID deaths have been among Black people in America, and they're 12% of the US population. In the justice system, we've probably heard figures like these before, but 33% of the prison population is Black, while Black Americans are 12% of the population. 30% of the prison population is white, but white people are 64% of the population. And there are significant disparities in sentencing for the same crimes. And Carissa Taylor is actually going to talk in the new year more about disparities in the justice system, which I am very much looking forward to. In wealth in America, there is also a significant gap. You can see this chart here from the Washington Post based on data from the Federal Reserve Bank. And adjusted for inflation, Black wealth has largely stagnated over the last several decades, while white wealth has grown. And if you look at the numbers there, Black households have about 1/10 of the wealth of white households. This is according to data that was published in the Washington Post. And this is showing wealth in the same article, median Black household wealth as a percentage of median white household wealth since the 60s. And one thing I think I was shocked by this, and I think a lot of us can tend to think, well, we passed civil rights laws in the 1960s, and now there's equal access to opportunity, and we've solved the problem. Things have gotten better, right? But if you look at the numbers, that actually is not true. And in this case, you can look that the numbers say that as a percentage of median white wealth, the wealth of Black families is similar or slightly worse than it was prior to civil rights. And you might say, is education the answer to this? Well, maybe it's really education that's the determinative factor and not race. But here in this same Washington Post article, they broke out according to every level of education. You see that sort of blue-green bar represents median household wealth of white people, and the pink bar represents median household wealth of Black people. In every category of education, there is a disparity. I thought this was interesting here as well. Small businesses in the era of COVID broken out by race, and it shows that Black small business has been hit twice as hard as white small business in the COVID era. And I wanted to point out that Grace in our Serving the City has been specifically working to come alongside Black businesses in our community. And this, I think, shows from a statistics standpoint why that's important that we are doing that work as a community. Home ownership has been one of the biggest drivers of middle-class wealth in American history. And there's a disparity there. For decades, it hovered around 70% of white people owning homes and 40% of Black people owning homes. But the disparity has grown since 2008. And you want to talk about how embedded in the activities of various institutions, systemic racism exists. The reason why that disparity has grown since 2008 is the Great Recession and the housing bust, because disproportionately the bad loans that were sold in the lead up to that were, it was Black people and people of color who were targeted for those. And so more people were foreclosed upon who were Black and who were people of color than white people. And there has been lasting impact as a result. And then towards the end of life, even the disparity continues. Retirement savings for white people aged 55 to 64, so getting ready to retire. The average retirement savings are 120,000, and for Black people of the same age, it's only 30,000, so that's a quarter of the amount. Another interesting statistic is that only 25% of retired Black people receive any income other than Social Security. So that's only 1/4 of Black people who are retired. Whereas 55% of white people receive some other income in addition to Social Security in their retirement. So these are facts based from data in the US Department of Labor, US Department of Agriculture, the Federal Reserve Bank, trusted sources, Washington Post, Reuters, and so on, that show different outcomes based on race. And they help us to see, regardless of our situation in life and who we network with and who our friends are, that there is a problem. And I think for us as Christians, seeing that there is a problem with new eyes, perhaps, there is a call for us towards compassion, and not just compassion as an emotion, but compassionate activity, volunteering, advocating, doing what we can to make a difference. And I think this helps us to see that just being polite and nice to everyone, regardless of their race, is not sufficient. But if there are these different outcomes, what are the causes of these different outcomes that are fairly well proven? And I think that you really only have two options. I've thought about this a lot. And essentially, it's that old question, nature or nurture, or nature or the environment. And I don't know if you remember this from, I think, our third class. It would have been back in early October. This guy, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, and he was one of many scholars that pursued quote unquote science. I mean, they wouldn't have put it in quotes at the time, but I categorized it as bad science, that really was trying to show biologically that white people were superior to Black people and other people of color around the world. And I think if you see these different kind of outcomes, your only two options are to say that either outcomes are different based on biology, which I don't think any of us want to hold. It's certainly not a popular view these days, and has scientifically been disproven, by the way, as we did talk about in our third lesson. Or it has to do with environment, system, structure, history, government policy, and choices that human beings have made over time within those organizations, which is systemic racism. So I entitled this class, Systemic Racism and the Powers. And that second part, and the powers, I'm referring to the powers and principalities, which is a theological concept that we have as the scriptures, in the scriptures. And I think it has compelling connections to this idea of systemic racism. I think it gives us a Christian theological framework to understand why there might be something like systemic racism and how we can think about forces that act in our world in a more collective or systemic way and not just an individual bad actor. I thought we would discuss this element, this idea a little bit, and apply it to a discussion of systemic racism. So Paul says in the 6th chapter of Ephesians, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." So there are many scriptures that you can point to that discuss this idea of powers and principalities. But Paul talks about it quite a bit. It is somewhat of an obscure idea that, in our churches, we don't often teach or talk about it, or if we do, it's in a passing reference. But this concept, I think, and many theologians think, is hugely central to Christian history to Christian ethics, and understanding the place and the mission of the church. And because of a variety of reasons, it has, since the Protestant Reformation, kind of taken a backseat. People haven't talked about this as much since that time until the 20th century. And there was a big renewal of thought and of dialogue among scholars about this theological concept in the 20th century. To me, I think it's a very compelling idea. I think it's one of the things that I find really beautiful and true about Christian faith when I talk to my non-Christian friends, because if people have a view of the world that human beings are basically good and we're going about our business, but then you talk about things like the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, countless examples of evil on a huge and destructive level. Many secular people or non-Christians, I don't feel like have a good explanatory framework for why that happens, because it's evil on such a large scale. It's hard to just say, oh, well, it's just one person who was outside of the norm and just got some power and made some bad decisions. Basically, human beings are good, but this guy Hitler, he was bad. I think that this is a really compelling idea that explains those kind of mass events, the problem of evil writ large in our world on a political and economic scale. Here's a book here by a theologian who's been significant to me for really my adult life, Marva J. Dawn. And I just, in doing research for this class, discovered she's a Washingtonian. I had no idea all these years. She lives not far from us in Washington, and she's retired now. She's a scholar who did study in this area of the powers and principalities. This is a great book called Powers, Weakness, and the Tabernacling of God, which was written about 20 years ago. And I highly recommend it. And so I'm gonna, what I talk about here is really reliant on her work to a large degree. As I mentioned, so in the 20th century, theologians would have recovered this category that is biblical, as we saw from Ephesians and elsewhere in the scriptures, because of the mass trauma of the 20th century, of the great wars, of the Holocaust, of many other things, the atomic bomb, and so on. It led to this resurgence of this idea of powers and principalities, spiritual forces that act upon human history and politics at a large scale. But scholars, in picking up this idea, would argue over whether, some of the scholars on the more sort of side of liberal Christianity would say this language was really, the ancient world's way of talking about things that aren't really spiritual. They're just the fact that sometimes governments and structures do bad things. They kind of de-spiritualize it. And on the other hand, you have people who were maybe more in the sort of Pentecostal realm, who were making it solely focused on individual spiritual beings or demons, unconnected to human institutions and so on. And what Marva Dawn talks about is this idea that powers and principalities are actually sort of connected with, they are spiritual forces that are connected with human organizations and influencing actively human organizations. There's actually a great video, and I wanted to put it in this, but I realized I wouldn't have time, and also video is a little bit challenging in its framework. But the Bible Project, if you haven't checked it out, it's amazing. And they have a 6-minute video called The Divine Council, which talks about this concept of powers and principalities and is, in their way, a very, very clear explanation of a somewhat complicated and obscure theological idea. So check that out. It's only 6 minutes, and it's great, great thought-wise and also great animation. So Marva Dawn in her book engages with a number of scholars to talk about the powers and principalities. And the question is, what are they? What do we mean when we say this? It seems obscure language in the New Testament when it talks about powers and principalities. According to one scholar, William Stringfellow, they are fallen creatures. They thrive in chaos, confusion, and competition. They create a dominion that does not foster life, but rather seeks to dehumanize human beings. They cause all to be victims, and this I think is important because it really, their goal is to dehumanize human beings, and they can do this on either side of a traumatic event. They dehumanize the victims through subjugation and trauma, but they also dehumanize the victimizers who are giving up their humanity for brutality. So if you think, for instance, about human torture or any number of things, but the torturer, the one who is torturing, is also losing some of their humanity by giving into powers and principalities. And so all become victims in this framework. They capture leaders as acolytes enthralled by the very things that are enslaving them. And here's an illustration from that Bible Project video on YouTube that is showing the sort of princes of this world, and behind their thrones are these dark, shadowy figures that have enslaved them. And so as they are making calls, setting priorities, leading people, they are under the thrall of these dark forces. Where are these forces at work in human society? John Howard Yoder, who's another significant scholar from the 20th century, Marva Dawn engages his work. He talks about the powers and principalities are at work in religious and intellectual frameworks, so ologies and isms, kind of, you think of things like communism versus capitalism, these sort of big frameworks of ideas are influenced by powers and principalities. Customs and cultures of our various ethnicities and countries around the world are shaped by these forces. Political structures and nations are shaped by these forces. The economy, media, and ideologies. So again, these, I think you can see right off the bat here why I find that this biblical and theological concept really connects to something like systemic racism, because it really is showing how evil spiritual forces are at work influencing human institutions and things on a systemic level, not just individual acts of sin. Of course, what we know in the biblical story, so one thing about this idea of the really throughout the Christian story and this idea of powers and principalities is that the Bible teaches that the conflicts, the spiritual conflicts that take place, and we're actually hearing this in Revelation in our teaching at Grace right now, are not something that is happening outside of the human realm, but actually the spiritual conflict between good and evil is happening right within the fabric of social existence, of human social existence. And so Marva Dawn says, that being the case, it's only by meeting the cosmic forces on the ground of history that Jesus could break their entrenched power. And of course, this fits very well with what we hear in Colossians 2:15, where Paul says, having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. But that's not all. Paul also says in Ephesians, his intent was that now through the church, the manifold wisdom of God should be made known to the rulers and authorities in the heavenly realms. So here we again, in Ephesians, hear this idea of the powers and principalities. Here it's translated the rulers and authorities. And post the victory that Christ won on the cross, here the church is called, the early church by Paul, to make known this victory that has already been accomplished to the rulers and the authorities in the heavenly realms. The church is called on to unmask the broken and dehumanizing activity of the powers and principalities, to find where they are at work, to partner with Jesus as his hands and feet, his body here in the world, and to do our part to try and set these things right, and to proclaim the reality of Christ's victory, and that it has already been accomplished in the face of these systemic dehumanizing forces that plague our world. So, with that said, we've talked about systemic racism, and I've kind of laid out my case for why I think it is a very useful category, why I think as Christians, whether we tend to be more conservative or more liberal or somewhere in between, it's not something that we need to be afraid of. It's not something that we need to jettison. It's actually something that can be quite at home within a Christian worldview. This concept is useful, and it's also acceptable to us as Christians. And it has a value of providing us with a useful way of seeing sometimes. Like I said, if we're stuck in our own niche of a world and we don't really understand what other people are going through, we can look at the numbers, look at the statistics and see, hey, these disparities are real, they are entrenched, they are heartbreaking, and that should move us to compassion, to saying, what can we do? How can we get outside of our small insular communities, get more connected to people who are in different circumstances, and as a church, work to create a difference. I hope you'll also see that this concept is useful, the concept of systemic racism, because it allows us to see that racism is more than just individual bad behavior. Since my earliest memories, I remember being in high school, and as a bunch of sort of grunge alternative kids, we were like all vehemently anti-racist. We would have said that, but at that time I had no concept of sort of what I'm talking about today, systemic racism, and I really thought it was really just about whether or not you treated people poorly or you didn't treat them poorly. And I think this is a very useful category for showing us that racism is much deeper and more pervasive and more deeply impactful than just a few individuals with bad behavior. We've also discussed how if nature is not the cause, then at some level, systems, by which I mean institutions and their histories and their norms and their cultures and their regulations, must be the reason for these disparities. And we've talked about the powers and principalities because I think it's a useful theological framework. I'm not saying it's necessary, but it's a useful theological framework for understanding how sin can be not just an individual thing, but a corporate problem that humanity faces that causes large-scale dehumanization. And so we talked about the powers, the dehumanizing powers, that are forces that work evil on a structural, political, and societal level. As you can see why connecting these two concepts, the powers and the idea of systemic racism, not only helps to show us as Christians how these ideas can be consonant for us instead of dissonant, but I think you can see how they inform each other in, I think, fruitful ways. One last thing that I want to point out, though, in talking about the powers and principalities, and this would be clear, for anyone. Again, I want to recommend Marva Dawn's book, Powers, Weakness, and the Tabernacling. There can be, when you start talking about demons or powers or spiritual forces, in some strains of Christianity, a tendency to sort of blame evil not on humans and absolve human beings and say, oh, well, those spiritual forces made me do it, or whatever. And that, of course, is not what I'm suggesting here. And I want to clearly state that even if we use this framework of powers and principalities to talk about systemic racism, that is not at all to absolve human beings from implications in making bad and racist policy, perpetrating and creating cultures that create disparity, and so on. And with that said, that is our presentation for today. I want to thank you all for showing up this morning, and I'd love to open the floor for comments and discussions and questions in the time that we have remaining today.
I've got one to kick off, if you don't mind.
Yeah, please.
I'm curious. Love the conversation. This is really good. I'm curious. As we're talking about, it doesn't absolve us individually and all that. I'm thinking about like the interaction between me personally and what systems I'm part of, and what difference I can make as an individual, or those kinds of things. But I'm also thinking about the scope. Did you look at, for example, are some of these systems uniquely American? Or are some of these systems things that we need to think about in Seattle? Are some of these things that are really kind of a Western culture issue? Kind of what was the blast radius of, at least, I mean, and obviously there's systems all over the world that are there for evil too, but is there something in particular that we need to go after in American society, or perhaps even Seattle, more tangibly, that we can do, or that you've seen in what you've researched?
Sure. I mean, what Marva Dawn would say is that this is part of the human condition, or even beyond the human condition, the nature of reality in the world. So the idea of the powers in her theology and in those of other scholars is that it infects institutions at every level. So every country throughout history on a national level, but also companies at a corporate level as they make decisions. And that could be companies that are multinationals. It also could be companies that are small local companies. It could be our local education system. It could, it would be really every human institution at every level of bigness or smallness. And again, I think that's something that squares well with the idea of systemic racism, because I think it can be shown that there are cultures and policies put in place, certainly at a national level throughout history in the United States, but also things on a local level or on a company level in various institutions. And so, yes, very much so, I believe it gives us a way as Christians, a framework to think local as well as national and global, and to think what forces are there at play in my neighborhood, in my town, in my school, that are dehumanizing, and how can I as a Christian move against them, pray against them, and so on.
And I would just add to that. That's an awesome question, Orion and Drew. This is fantastic class. I would just add to that the key in the Old and New Testament behind the quote unquote gods, lowercase g, or the spiritual powers that Paul talks about is not just dehumanizing evil actions, but idolatry. So some of the work of the powers is not just evil things that happen, but also idolatry that turns people away from the living God. This is why Jesus, even in Revelation, as Drew pointed out, he's so key on rebuking the churches, particularly Laodicea and Ephesus, on their participation with Babylon, with Jezebel, with these large systems that foster idolatry and the love of money. So just to add that, it's not just dehumanization, it's also idolatry away from God.
Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. And actually, I had a note to mention in my presentation, and I skipped over it. I forgot to connect to that idea that you and John have been talking about the beast and the harlot, basically the two forms of seduction, and that's a part of this as well. That it's either a question of the power. The powers seducing people or the powers crushing people. Other questions or thoughts?
I have more of just like something that I'm interested to know how other people are doing or processing this information, but being aware that we're in a system of systemic racism is a large problem that we are often unintentionally aware of and participating in. It's difficult to feel like I can change as an individual actor or in a small group, and it can make me feel powerless to go up against these systems. And something like Jason mentioned early on when we were this summer when we were talking about the Black Lives Matter movement, he's like, I hope it continues. I mean, because we've had movements like this in the past and then they fizzle out. And I think that's like, there was a lot more turmoil earlier in the summer, and now we've kind of been overwhelmed by other things. Maybe the work of serving the city, we're doing some things to kind of maybe turn the tide or help work against this. And I didn't know if there's efforts, maybe Jason, that you could speak to this, or other things that people think like, wow, this is a really effective broader scope initiative that is kind of turning the tide that we can support or be more aware of how it can support, as opposed to maybe smaller actions. Not that smaller actions, more direct service, that's my bet, more direct service is really helpful and useful, but if our scope is very large, if the problem is very large, what kind of actions can we take?
Yeah, Jason, did you want to speak to that?
I can try. I think that's a huge dynamic, and I kind of feel like, honestly, there are some things that we're trying to do with Serve the City to address things systemically, and I can speak to those. But I always have to personally return, because I can get very overwhelmed, is what is Paul talking about? When he talks about these spiritual powers, he's dealing with a pastoral, very local, individual issue. So when it comes to the Ephesian church, what's going on in the Ephesian church? There's friction, there's a lack of love, there's friction between the races, between Jew and Gentile. And so in Ephesians chapter 2, he's talking about, hey, some of you are far off, some of you are close by, but Jesus brought and made us one by his blood, by his victory and death on the cross. He's killed the hostility, right? So then the very next chapter, he talks about this mystery of Jew and Gentile being united, of racial ethnic tension being fixed in the cross. And this manifold wisdom is being proclaimed to these powers and principalities. And Drew pointed out very clearly that some of the work of these powers is to foster division between people groups. So just on a local pastoral level, what is Paul advocating for? He's saying that the church must be about proclaiming the unity of the reunification, reconciliation of the human race in the cross of Christ. And that it's simply proclaiming this to the world, to the cosmos, that is part of our work of undoing the powers and principalities. So for me, it's participating in ways that we are walking out reconciliation on an individual level. In Colossae, they're giving in to mystery religions, and he's like, your union with Christ should be the solution, that Jesus Christ has served on notice that the powers and principalities are now rebuked and disarmed. So your union with Christ is a solution. Your personal connection to Christ ties you to his victory. So I think structurally what Serving the City, what we're trying to do, Drew pointed out, we're trying to support, Black and brown businesses. We're trying to support working across different churches of different ethnic and theological backgrounds as part of that work, that reconciling work between Jew and Gentile, Black and white, multi-ethnic congregations. So I'm kind of shooting from the hip here to answer that, but I would say addressing, and I think Drew has been really good about this, calling out evil, whether that's from a political stance, highlighting issues that are happening in our schools and our hospitals, but also just doing the reconciling work of partnering with different churches and traditions and people groups. So,
yeah, and I would add a few things. One, just on that question of the importance of proclaiming what has been accomplished. And well, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought, but that verse in chapter 6 of Ephesians that we read, it says, the struggle is not against flesh and blood. And so this, beyond the, even issues of racism, you think about the last election, so many other things where even as Christians, we tend to be caught up in that division of sort of reacting to flesh and blood, rather than realizing, oh, if there's something making division here, if I'm not seeing eye to eye here, or if large groups of people are not seeing eye to eye or missing things, that battle is against powers and principalities and not flesh and blood. And so teaching ourselves to not do the knee-jerk reaction as Christians, whatever side of the fence we're on or whatever, but to resort to prayer, I think, for one thing. Another thing in response, a few other things I'm thinking, Tess. One is that I think we need to change our habits. And I think that that's something that I know with Serving the City has been important to Jason. Right now, Grace has begun this new initiative. A lot of it has been, up to this point, building partnerships and financially supporting organizations. But the more that we can train ourselves to involve ourselves, our persons, our lives, our time, volunteering, I think that makes a huge difference. And when I say that, that's the kind of thing that, is sitting on me too, because I need to change my ways and my habits with that regard as well. And I think it's something we really need to look at as a congregation moving forward. I also think just the fact that we're talking about big things, systemic things on a national level, they seem huge and immovable. We should never underestimate the power of the small. None of us is famous. We're not elected officials. We don't have a huge Twitter following. I mean, maybe some of you do, I don't know. But instead of getting overwhelmed by our lack of power. I think the way forward is small acts of Christian faithfulness and goodness in our purview. Any other thoughts or questions? We have a few minutes left before we need to close this morning.
I just want to applaud you, Drew. I have not. I've done some reading and studying on this, and only until the last couple of years have I been really hip to this teaching, because it is rather deficient in the Protestant realm, and I'm just curious on an intellectual level what people are thinking theologically, and just with your imaginations of what's happening in the spiritual realm. Mark Sayers in his podcast and his books talks about the powers and principalities, and how even through technology and our hyper individualism, we can be easily shaped by multinational corporations, and we don't even think about it. Think about your use of your phone and what Google and other entities do, that makes you very privy to these powers, that it makes you accessible to these powers in a direct way. But I think my mind goes everywhere. I just want to know what people think. Like Psalm 82, God says, I'm sitting in a council with the gods, right? And he's waging war. That's very consonant with Jesus and his battle over these spiritual powers in his cross. Daniel talks about powers, multinational powers, angelic figures that are doing battle, right? There's lots of interesting things. I wonder what you think. Even in indigenous cultures or Greco-Roman tradition, the competing agendas of the gods on Olympus, these are ideas that are not just in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and I'm curious what people think.
Well, after that great prompt, we are at the top of the hour, but it would be lovely to have more conversation about these, because I've applied it here to systemic racism, but there are so many applications of this concept. I did want to point out before we close today, this will be our last session until after the holidays and into the new year. So the next Christian formation class will be Sunday, January 17th, and that one will be led by Jason. So we will be moving into a new year, and we have a bunch of speakers lined up, including members of our community like Susie Becker and Carissa Taylor, but also a number of other guest presenters that are going to join us. So something to look forward to. Thanks for showing up, and I hope you all have a blessed Sunday.